Let's look live at the White House right now, where we are listening in as President Donald Trump moments ago took questions.
It's important to even talk about them. It'll save us a lot of money, but we don't want that. We want education to be given. So you go to Iowa and Indiana and Idaho and all these places that are so well run. They're going to be producing education that will be the equivalent of, like Denmark is one, and Norway, Sweden. Actually, China is one of the better in terms of education, and so we can't blame size anymore. You know, China has 1.4 billion people, but they're very high on the list. The one thing we're doing well on, we're number one on the list, is cost per pupil. We spend more money than any other country in the world by far. So I jokingly say the one thing we do well on is the cost. We spend more money, and yet we're toward the bottom of the list. Yeah.
Mr. President, I want to ask you, the joint address, millions of Americans watched your joint address earlier this week, where you warned that there could be a little disturbance that Americans could feel as a function of these taxes, these tariffs. How much disturbance are you willing to accept in the near term as a function of that? And to set expectations, how long should Americans expect things to cost a bit more?
Well, so far, Peter, there hasn't been very much, because these numbers are coming out. We're here for just a little over 4 weeks. And these are fantastic numbers. I was watching some of the reports this morning. They were surprised. There could be some disturbance, a little bit of disturbance. I solved a little bit of that because I have respect for our auto companies, and I gave them a little bit of a 1-month reprieve because it was unfair, although I'm sure they'll take advantage of it. I see they're driving a lot of cars into the U.S. to try and avoid the tariffs, and taking advantage of it a little bit. But they called me, they asked me, they said, could they have a little bit of help? And I decided, they're American companies, USMCA, and I let them have that. But this really kicks in, the reciprocals, kicks in on, let's see, I guess the 2nd. And I wanted it to be the 1st so badly. I just didn't want to be on April Fool's Day. So I made it the 2nd. That's going to cost a lot of money. That one day is going to cost a lot of money, but that's okay. But I don't see it. I don't see anything. I see good reports. I think we're going to have good numbers from the beginning. Now, globalists won't love this because this brings jobs back to America. So if they're coming back to America, maybe you'll lose some in other parts of the world. But the other parts of the world have done very well, and they'll continue to do very well. But I think the United States is going to be doing record business. We'll bring a lot of those 90,000 factories that have been lost over the last number of years. It's been, it's hard to believe. 90,000, think of what 90,000 is. 90,000 plants and factories are gone. We're going to bring back many of those plants and factories.
One day the tariffs are on, the next day they're off. Right now the markets, as you know well, prefer stability. Are you done going forward with the pauses and the carve-outs? Is that it for those?
There'll always be changes and adjustments, and you can't just. I could have, for instance, told the American car companies, "No, I'm not going to give you anything," and then you wouldn't have had to say, "Well, they're getting a little extra." It's just a little bit of a 1-month reprieve. They're very happy about what's happening. They won't have to go across borders, and you see the zigzagging. You have a fender made in Canada, you have something else made in Mexico. We don't want that. We want it made here. But there'll always be some modifications. I mean, if you have a wall in front of you, sometimes you have to go around the wall instead of through it. But I think very little. I think very little. On occasion, if we can do something, we want to help companies. We want to help companies create jobs. So I could have left that, and you wouldn't have had a minor change. Instead, I was asked by the real majors, the big majors, if they could do this. And I said, yeah, I'll do it. I want you to produce a lot of jobs. And numerous of the people, actually all of the people I spoke to have already been, they're very much on the way to already doing it. That's why you have auto jobs increase. And the man, I don't know him, Sean Fain, I don't know him, and I did great, as you know, with the auto workers, with the Teamsters, with unions. I did fantastically well, best numbers ever by a Republican. And I have a lot of respect for those people. But Sean Fain, who I don't know, but wasn't a supporter, although the auto workers were big supporters. I watched him last night, and he said, Donald Trump is absolutely right on tariffs. He said, what he's doing on tariffs is an incredible thing. And it's about time somebody had the guts to do it, because we're going to save auto manufacturing. And I said to people when I was campaigning, You're going to have so many auto jobs, you're not going to believe what's going to happen. We're going to load up Michigan. I won the state of Michigan, as you know. And part of the reason I won it was I got a lot of auto workers that voted for me, Detroit, et cetera. But I think people are going to be very surprised. Yes?
Thank you, Mr. President. You mentioned in your remarks chips manufacturing, how a significant percentage is now in Taiwan. You also mentioned it in your address to Congress, and you called on Congress to overturn the CHIPS Act, which had bipartisan support in the last Congress. Why would you like to see this particular law overturned, Mr. President?
Because it's hundreds of billions of dollars and it's just a waste of money. Now, some people have already taken the money and used it. Actually, it's very hard to qualify because they go by race, they go by gender, they go by all sorts of things. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. You won't be able to find those people. So I don't even think anybody can qualify. They have so many different categories in order to qualify. You have to have so many of a certain race, a certain gender, a certain this, a certain, and I don't think they can qualify, but if they take the money, they better qualify because they'll be watching them. But it's a tremendous waste of money. I didn't give the greatest chip company in the world, one of the greatest companies, I didn't give them 10 cents. They came here because of tariffs, because they didn't want to pay the tariffs. And they also came here because they like the results of the election, because they know that I'm very pro-business and pro-jobs. I mean, I'm pro-business, not for business sake. I'm pro-business because of jobs, because business is producing the jobs. Okay?
On Russia, if I may, President Putin is bombing Ukraine.
Yeah.
Do you still believe him when he tells you that he wants peace?
Yeah, no, I believe him. I believe him. I think we're doing very well with Russia. But right now they're bombing the hell out of Ukraine, and Ukraine. I'm finding it more difficult, frankly, to deal with Ukraine, and they don't have the cards. They don't have the cards. As you know, we're meeting in Saudi Arabia on sometime next week, early, and we're talking. Would I find that in terms of getting a final settlement, it may be easier dealing with Russia, which is surprising because they have all the cards. I mean, they're bombing the hell out of them right now. And I put a statement in, a very strong statement. Can't do that. You can't do that.
Mr. President.
We're trying to help them. And Ukraine has to get on the ball and get a job done. Michael, could you come up here? I see Michael back there. Good. I'm glad. He's traveling all over the world. I just saw him come in the door. Could you give a little definition of what's going on, please?
Sure. Well, the president has been crystal clear, and he's been clear to all sides. The fighting has to stop. Both sides need to get to the table. We had a good engagement. Both leaders have said only President Trump could do so, and only he has been able to do so. We had an initial engagement with the Russians. The Ukrainians had a great opportunity to bind our economies together through that mineral deal. Unfortunately, that didn't go so well, but we think we're going to get things back on track. Secretary Rubio, myself, and the Ukrainian delegation will be meeting in Saudi Arabia next week to get these talks back on track, get the ceasefire in place, and drive peace home under President Trump's leadership.
I think both parties want to settle. I think if I wasn't president, this war would have had no chance of settlement, zero chance. But I think we're going to get it settled and stopped. We got to stop. They're losing on average 2,000 soldiers a week. That's a lot of soldiers. Do you agree, Peter?
It's a lot of soldiers on both sides. I agree. Do you, Mr. President, think that Vladimir Putin is taking advantage of the U.S. pause right now on intelligence and military aid to Ukraine?
No, I actually think he's doing what anybody else would do. I think he wants to get it stopped and settled, and I think he's hitting them harder than he's been hitting them. And I think probably anybody in that position would be doing that right now. He wants to get it ended, and I think Ukraine wants to get it ended, but I don't see it's crazy. They're taking tremendous punishment. I don't quite get it, but I suspect, Michael, he probably wants to get it ended.
He does, Mr. President. The Russians are taking incredible losses on the front. As the president has said, this is a meat grinder of people, of material, of national treasure, and no one else has any solutions except to let this war continue forever. But I'll add, the president has had multiple conversations and a visit from President Macron of France, Prime Minister Starmer of the United Kingdom. We have the NATO Secretary General coming next week. We have this meeting with the Ukrainians. We've had it with the Russians. All of this in the president's first month in his leadership. We will engage in the shuttle diplomacy, and we will continue to use his leadership and what leverage we have to get both sides of the peace table. It's not going to be easy, but President Trump...
This war should have never happened. It would have never happened if I were president. But it did happen. So a lot of other things shouldn't have happened, too. We shouldn't have 21 million people pouring into our country through open borders, many of whom are criminals, very bad criminals, including murderers, thousands of murderers. Many killed, far more than one person, and they're roaming our streets. But Tom Holman and Kristi Noem are doing an incredible job, and we're getting them out of here. And we'll get them out. We'll get them all out. But all these things shouldn't have happened. We shouldn't have inflation. We shouldn't have had this horrible inflation where the prices have gone up. Look at eggs. So we're doing a good job. We're doing a good job.
President, in regards to the pause on military assistance to Ukraine, you put out on your social media post today that Russia is pounding Ukraine.
That's right.
Why not provide Ukraine with air defenses? And what happens, Mr. President, when Ukraine runs out of...
Well, because good question. Because I have to know that they want to settle. I don't know that they want to settle. If they don't want to settle, we're out of there because we want them to settle. And I'm doing it to stop death, more important than anything else. Secondarily, way down the line is the money. So we're in for $350 billion, and Europe is in for $100 billion. They should be in for the same or more than us. And, you know, I watched over the last week or so what's going on in Europe. This thing could end up in World War III if we don't get it settled. This could really end up in a World War III. We got to get it settled.
So on Iran, how confident are you that the Iranians will negotiate with you? And is Israel on board with this outrage?
Yeah, I saw the hostages the other day. They came in, people that were not young, some young and some older, much older. And they gave, it was hard for them to do it, actually. They gave statements as to what happened. I was asking, what happened? How was it? I said, did you see anybody in there that was kind, like out of the hundreds of people that you were seeing, Hamas? Did some of them wink at you and say, don't worry, you're going to be okay, or give you a piece of bread, or no? I said, were there any people that were, like, kind? I was shocked. The answer was nobody. There was nobody. Just the opposite. They'd be slapped and punched. One man broke his ribs. He couldn't breathe for a month. It was brutal. I was so surprised because you'd think there'd be a couple of people that would be kind, that would say, you're going to be okay. But they had none of that. It's pretty amazing. Brian?
Thank you, Mr. President.
He's a kind person.
Well, according to...
Although not to Zelensky, he wasn't.
Well, you know what, that's another
But to Trump, he's
conversation.
been good.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Brian.
Nice tie, by the way. We coordinated. Two questions. One on peace. Why don't you think any other European countries are offering a peace deal? It seems like no one's come to the table for peace except for you.
Yeah. It's a very good question. Sometimes questions aren't answerable. They're in a very unusual position. They don't know how to end the war. I think I do know how to end the war. Despite the Russia hoax, I've always had a good relationship with Putin. And, you know, he wants to end the war. He wants to end it. And I think he's going to be more generous than he has to be. And that's pretty good. That means a lot of good things. Because, frankly, you could have made a great deal if this war never started, you could have made a great deal. I don't know that anything would have had to be given up. This was not a war that was going to start, Brian. And it didn't start. For 4 years, somebody said, well, how do we know that? Well, for 4 years, it didn't start. I used to speak to Vladimir about it. I used to speak to him about it at length. It was the apple of his eye, but there was no way he was going in. And he knew, there were going to be consequences. But it did start. I mean, think of what happened. Inflation, you have the war with Ukraine and Russia, that wouldn't have happened. October 7th would have never happened. Israel, they had no money. Iran had no money. Iran was stone cold broke. and now they have a lot of money. But that's going to be the next thing you'll be talking about is Iran. What's going to happen with Iran? And there'll be some interesting days ahead. That's all I can tell you. You know, we're down to final strokes with Iran. That's going to be an interesting time. And we'll see what happens. But we're down to the final moments. We're at final moments. Can't let them have a nuclear weapon. I think that I would have had a deal within 1 month after the rigged election of 2020. They were all set to make a deal. And then when I lost, they saw this person who's a stupid person, very stupid person. And they said, let's not make a deal. And they were right. He took the sanctions off. They became rich under Biden. They went from having no money to having $300 billion. All in a short period. It's oil. Oil builds up fast. It's a nice living if you have a nice oil well. And they do. They have a lot of nice oil wells, right? So anyway, it's going to be a big thing. It's an interesting time in the history of the world. But we have a situation with Iran that something's going to happen very soon. Very, very soon. You'll be talking about that pretty soon, I guess. And hopefully we can have a peace deal. You know, I'm not speaking out of strength or weakness. I'm just saying I'd rather see a peace deal than the other. But the other will solve the problem.
Mr. President, your allies are calling on you to pardon Derek Chauvin. Are you considering pardoning Derek Chauvin?
No, I haven't even heard about it. No.
Mr. President, on peace.
I haven't heard that.
In the first term, you may recall, I broke the news that you were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. And the reason for that was the work that you led on the Abraham Accords. I spoke yesterday with the member of parliament, the Norwegian parliament, that nominated you. And he said what the Nobel Committee is looking for from you, Mr. President, is security guarantees for Ukraine. Is that a possibility, Mr. President?
So before I even think about that, I want to settle the war, get it finished. Because if I'm not here, nobody's going to settle it. And President Macron has said that, and everybody said that, the prime ministers and presidents. We're pushing very hard. That's all I'm thinking about now. As far as the question about security later, that's the easy part. The hard part is getting it settled. We got to get them. We're losing 2,000 human beings every week. More than that, actually. 2,000 nice, young, although they're getting older because they're drafting much older now. In the case of one country, much older, because a lot of the young people have been killed. It's very sad, and I'd like to see if I could stop that. And I'd like to also see if we could stop making these massive payments from the United States. I mean, Biden gave away money like it was water.
All right, you have been listening to President Donald Trump moments ago in a wide-ranging conversation with members of the media on domestic and international issues, everything from Donald Trump's tariffs to what appears to be a first-name basis relationship with President Vladimir Putin of Russia. Let's bring in Elizabeth Cook now, who's going to continue our coverage here. It struck me something that the president said. He said that Russia will have to give up more than they should have to. That's striking to me to remember that Russia went in, annexed Crimea, and they were the ones who invaded Ukraine. It appears that the president may have a different view on that issue.
Yeah, it's an interesting stance, especially because today he sent out that post on Truth Social saying that there may be sanctions against Russia. So it's an interesting kind of dichotomy here, interesting relationship that we're going to dive into in this show. Reed, thanks so much.
Have a good Friday.
All right, you too. All right, let's continue this conversation with CBS News Chief White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. She is standing by for us at the White House. Weijia, remarkable press conference there in the Oval Office. What were the headlines for you?
Yeah, Trump always makes a ton of news of these things, and today was certainly no exception. So as you and Reed were just talking about, he did talk about the war in Ukraine after Russia invaded, and he said he still believes that Vladimir Putin wants peace there, even though he also said in almost the same sentence that, he is, quote, bombing the hell out of Ukraine. What's interesting is that the president went on to say that he finds it more difficult frankly, to deal with Ukraine in peace talks. Of course, we all remember that Oval Office blow up that they had, and now both sides are trying to get things back on track, especially Zelensky, who has issued a public statement. We don't know, though, what Trump exactly is looking for from Ukraine to prove that it wants peace. And Liz, he also talked about the economy as we are locked in this trade war with Canada and Mexico and China. And you'll remember during his joint address to Congress, he said, look, there might be some disturbances in the meantime when it comes to tariffs, meaning that Americans might have to pay a little bit more. So he was asked how much of a disturbance and for how long. But one thing he hasn't talked about is, you know, a money figure on how much the average American family might have to pay and for how long. But he did continue to defend why he's using these tariffs, saying that manufacturing is pouring back into the United States. We also know, Liz, that he said he will sign an executive order to dismantle the education department, but reiterated that they want to give more power and money to the states. But he hasn't committed to a time, Liz, for when that's happening. We have learned that that's because, of course, the Department of Education oversees billions and billions of dollars worth in student loans, and they have to find an off-ramp for that and fold it into another agency, likely Treasury.
Yeah, I was waiting to hear a little bit more about, I want to get back to Russia here in a second, but there was a letter to Iran from the president on nuclear deal negotiations. He referenced that in that press conference. What more do we know about it?
We know that the president wants to be viewed on the global stage as a peacemaker, as a deal maker in chief. And so to that end, he does believe that he can broker some kind of an agreement with Iran. During his first term, he actually came in and pulled out of the existing agreement that the U.S. and Iran were part of. But he did say in the Oval just now that hopefully we can have a peace deal. The president said, that he hopes something can happen, quote, pretty soon. And that he would have had a deal earlier, but he blamed President Biden for not moving that ball forward, Liz. As far as the details of what that deal could look like, we still don't know exactly what the president has in mind.
I also want to ask you about this meeting the president held with Elon Musk and key cabinet members yesterday. What happened there, and is this an indication that Trump could possibly be pulling back the reins on Musk?
So the president's message on that was that each department and agency head is going to have the ultimate say in terms of their staffing and their budget cuts, et cetera. And it did appear that he was taking a little bit of that authority away from Elon Musk. But it's notable that he went on to say that Musk would still be directly involved and would still be advising these departments. And so this was a very lengthy statement. And I think the thing that stuck out to me, Liz, was that he said we will now be using a scalpel instead of a hatchet. But he's already used the hatchet. We have been reporting extensively on the tens of thousands of federal workers who have already lost their jobs. So while we continue to see sort of a walk back from these mass terminations, in many cases, the damage has already been done. But now we'll have to see moving forward just how much Elon Musk is involved with every department.
Weijia, before you go, I want to circle back to Ukraine and Russia, because earlier today, the president said on Truth Social that there could be sanctions against Russia. What options are on the table here when it comes to sanctions against Russia, given this sort of complicated relationship we have here?
Well, and given the fact that there are already so many sanctions in place on Russia. But White House officials tell us that there are still many avenues to explore, and that includes sanctioning Russian oil, sanctioning banks that are currently not on the list, and sanctioning China for any business that they do with Russia. So there are more options on the table that he is willing to use if it gets to that, because again, in that same post, he was expressing frustration, Liz, about the ongoing violence and bombing in Ukraine, even though he is focused on an end and on brokering a peace deal.
Weijia Jiang live for us at the White House. Thanks so much for that insight, Weijia. All right, we are keeping an eye on the Dow as markets react to all of this breaking news from the White House today. President Trump's swerving tariff policy prompted a roller coaster on Wall Street, to say the least. The Dow is down nearly 3% this week. The Nasdaq entered correction territory. So let's bring in CBS News MoneyWatch correspondent Kelly O'Grady. Kelly, when asked if we've seen the last of these on-again, off-again tariff policies, the president said, quote, "There will always be changes and adjustments." So what does the uncertainty mean for American businesses?
Yeah, this is the tough piece of this, because you have businesses that are looking at the situation. You know, one day it's a tariff, the next day there's a carve out, the next day the deadline has been pushed, and these businesses are having to make decisions about inventory, about hiring, all sorts of different things, and they're making it in a very uncertain environment. And that is also why you're seeing the market go up and down, because investors are having to make investment decisions, pick sectors and stocks where they want to put their money in that similarly uncertain environment. I think what was interesting that did come up today is this idea of reciprocal tariffs. It does look like there's going to be even more tit for tat with Canada. The president said as soon as today there could be a reciprocal tariff on Canadian lumber and dairy products. That's an interesting one, I felt, Liz, simply because Canada does not have a tariff on the U.S. It's that they subsidize their own domestic industry. But that does go back to the president's previous comments that tariff or non-tariff ways in order to keep out U.S. companies and industries from each of these nations he would be considering as a tariff. So very curious to see if that does indeed happen today. But yes, Liz, it does go back to this uncertain environment that businesses and investors and consumers are operating in.
Yeah, I can imagine. I want to talk about the new jobs data out today, Kelly, because Trump is touting a boost in manufacturing jobs. But remember, that boost comes at the same time as huge cuts to the federal government. So what can you tell us about that?
So this particular jobs report that we got today, it was adding 151,000, a little bit less than we expected, 170,000. But basically the headline was the jobs market is slowing, but I think there was a lot of relief that we didn't see something worse. When it comes to the DOGE cuts, specifically the government cuts, there were 10,000 less federal jobs that were open this month. But really the majority of these cuts that we're seeing over the past month or so, that's actually not going to show up in this report until the next month or two. It's really just about how the survey is done, when it's done, and how they classify this. But the president is right, and I actually just pulled this up before I hopped on with you. Over the past couple of months, we have seen manufacturing jobs drop. And even a year ago, same thing. This same month in 2024, we saw negative 13,000 manufacturing jobs. We saw an increase of 10,000 today, and that does go back to the tariffs. You have seen companies commit to moving that here, but one sector goes up, one sector goes down. You know, it really depends on how you sort of play out whether it's net positive or net negative.
Yeah, it's a roller coaster, as we said. We're on the ride. All right, Kelly O'Grady, thanks so much.